I'm part of Arise Alliance Institute, and they are located in Tampa, Florida. And we launched this mission to kind of hopefully, transform the way we see mental health, more like mental wellness, trying to normalize the human experience. And a whole group of us clinicians got together and just thought, there's some things that are missing in our field. And, put together all of our experiences, the training that we've gone through, and kind of sifted through things and said, how can we create kind of a map to help not just clinicians, but I think this has been very valuable to just people to normalize some of the struggles that we go through. This is a topic that's like very close to my heart because as a first generation Mexican American, there's not a lot of talk about mental health in my culture. You never would have told me that I was going to be a therapist when I grew up. We had like one diagnosis, está loco, and that's it. They're crazy, and that there's no, you're depressed and anxious, none of that. It's just one diagnosis. So I kind of landed in this field. It kind of called to me whenever I was selling furniture and got offered a job in the field and just never left. I found my passion, and I think it's given me the opportunity to transform a lot of my own experiences, to better understand this whole journey that we're all on as humans. And so my passion is really to simplify, some of these complex concepts in our field and make it accessible and practical for our communities. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. I guess my first question to you is this is something that I kind of struggled with a little bit, not only um going through it, but maybe
Mhm.
trying to explain it as well. What are a couple of misconceptions or myths that you'd like to debunk or clarify when it comes to mental health and why?
You know, it 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 really kind of baffles me how we understand how like our body works, right? Digestion works and the things that we do naturally, why it's important to take care of like our body and what we consume physically. We know about nutrition, about vitamins and minerals, and how that impacts how we feel, how we function, our clarity, our energy, all of those things. But we don't think about the mind and the things we consume mentally and how that impacts our energy, our ability to function, our body budget, all of those things. And I think part of that is culturally, especially if any of you like grew up in a culture like mine that just there's pride, there's pride like I am kind of the expert in my life, which is so true. We are all so different. We're the expert of our own experience. Um, but also there's a misconception that mental health means, you have to be mentally ill to seek out mental health treatment. And that's not true. In fact, I think a lot of the challenges that we face never really, meet the threshold of mental illness. And yet there are tools that we can learn. And if we had a better understanding of how our mind works, how memory works, how experiences impact us, I think that people would realize how important these things are in terms of being able to live life to its fullest. So that's kind of our mission right now is to like fight the stigma just by normalizing this human experience.
I wonder sometimes, like when I went through my own journey from a mental health perspective, there's a lot of things I learned about myself, and there's a lot of things I learned about other people. And then another thing that I learned after that was, man, there's a lot of people out there that are impacting my mental health in a negative way,
Yeah.
right? And then you
Yeah.
look back and you try to figure out like why you were tolerating or accepting of that behavior. Why do you think some people struggle with identifying what is maybe causing them to not be as mentally fit or to have these triggers and respond in the way that they do?
Lack of awareness. I mean, think about it. Like for myself, I grew up in a Mexican household, so I spoke Spanish. That was my native tongue. That was my native language. It's what was familiar to me. not just like language wise, but what we learn about relationships, what love is, what connection is, how the world works, our identity, right? As a Hispanic woman, like what minority means, what my role is supposed to be in this world. All of these things are learned implicitly through our experiences. Nobody told me, hey, you're supposed to be inferior to everyone else, but my experiences led me to believe that. And these things happen as we grow up, or we have parents that are absent or that, haven't worked through their own stuff. They have their own struggles, and we feel unappreciated, we feel undervalued, and so therefore we decide that we're not worthy, or we're not as important, or we learn to shut off our own needs for the sake of maintaining relationships or whatever it is, and we don't even realize we learned that. So that becomes our normal. You don't know how else to be. And in Spanish we have a saying that's cada cabeza es un mundo, which means every head is its own world. And that it's really true. Like, my perception is based off of the experiences that I had, and it impacts how I interpret your behavior, how I interpret how you approach me or the things that you say. And we don't even realize that because it's all we know. Until it causes issues and we're banging our head against the wall because we find ourselves stuck in these loops, or we're like, I must be a terrible person because I know better, so I should do better. And it's not that simple. It's a lot more complicated than that. And so it really comes down to, I always say, like, we all have this, like, the standard human package, but we didn't get the manual. So really understanding like how humans work is key in being able to kind of reclaim that agency or that sense of control over your life.
What would you share, like when you're speaking to your clients and people in general, what advice do you share to them to help them understand that, you know what, it could be because you're not as aware, or maybe it was your upbringing, or maybe it could be your culture, it could be a number of things. Don't beat yourself up. Here's the guide to help you along to understand it better.
Yeah, I think that part of where we go wrong is we kind of preach and encourage all the stuff that is the outcome as a result of exploring. So in other words, you hear a lot of things about like having self-compassion or learning to love yourself. How the heck do you do that? Like, you don't even know that you don't like yourself. You don't know that you don't really have a good relationship with yourself because you don't have any other reference point, right? I don't know what it feels like to be you. So to try to translate that is really, really difficult. When somebody walks into my office, the first thing I try to do is really normalize what they go through. So somebody comes in with anxiety or like PTSD symptoms, explaining how the nervous system works, explaining how memory, uh, I call it digestion because it's like a process, the importance of experiencing emotion, all of those things, and why when we don't have that, the issues that can emerge, that it can cause in terms of like as life gets more difficult and more complex, it becomes hard to use the same tools you used as a child to survive, much less to thrive. And so I really begin with normalizing their experience. Of course, this is happening. Of course, you're feeling that way. Your nervous system thinks you're still under attack because it hasn't processed that memory. And so every time it gets pulled up, it goes into the fight or flight. It really begins by understanding, like I said, it's part of the standard human package. This is how you come with the nervous system, how your brain or how your body recalls information, and making those connections through understanding, you start getting a new perspective, which then could lead to more compassion for your experience.
There was someone that I used to be friends with, and she struggled with that. And instead of tuning into what she was feeling
Mhm.
and the trauma, she would act out in different ways. So I remember she developed this thing where she was like, anytime she was stressed out, anytime she was embracing her trauma, right? Like when it'll come to the
Mhm.
surface, she'd be
Yes.
like, okay, I need to go distract myself. So she would like find someone to have like an intimate moment with,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because that
Because that's how
way,
she connected, right? That's how she
exactly.
used to connect. She didn't. So this is a perfect example of how, I worked with youth that had like sexual maladaptive behavior. So it could be anywhere from being adjudicated of crimes to, engaging. Like you work with a 15-year-old that is out on the streets selling herself, and somebody who has not had her experience might think, how could you do that? That's traumatic. But to that individual, if that's what they've been taught that they're worth, then it's empowering to them to be able to make some money off of it, right? Like people don't understand that if you look at the whole context, then the behavior makes sense. And it really comes down to survival. It comes down to how the individual views the world, views themselves, perceives like their capacity. Because if you don't know what you're capable of until you step out of what you know, and that's the scariest thing. That's why it's hard for us to change, because the older we get, the more we want to stay in familiarity. I mean, you ever try to like learn another language as an adult? It is so hard. What we could do naturally as a kid is so hard as an adult, because we kind of get set into what we think reality is, and to leave that, it stresses us out. It causes some stress, and but it's necessary to grow. But if you're already in survival mode because you have like trauma, or things like that, then you don't have the budget to expand. You don't. It's like you're broke in terms of energy. So how are you going to learn new things and expand outside of what you know? You get stuck in the survival loop, and you never truly get to experience your full potential.
And that's exactly what she struggled with. Like it became her currency,
Yes. Yeah. You
right?
know, part of why I'm so passionate, because my own experiences being, a first generation Mexican American, I didn't learn English until kindergarten. And so first day of kindergarten, I came in and they sat me at the back in this table, and I wanted to sit with the big group, but they told me, no, you belong here. And my little brain, 5 years old, you're still making sense of the world. And so I'm like, well, what is it about me that puts me here? I didn't even think about language. I just thought, I don't know what it is. The kid next to me didn't know his last name. I remember his poor kid's name was Luis. And when he said he didn't have a last name, I was like, oh my God, Luis is an idiot. I was pretty judgy 5-year-old, I think, because I remember literally thinking that. And then I paused and I thought, wait a minute, I'm at his table. Oh my gosh, I'm an idiot too, and I didn't even know it. And I remember this other moment, they pulled out this big chart. It was the ABCs. I hadn't learned the alphabet, from my family. So the other kids knew it and I didn't. And that just solidified this belief that I was dumb. And so guess what happened? From kindergarten all the way through even my first attempt at college, I did really poor academically. I mean, I had straight F's in fourth grade. I was always like fighting at school, getting in trouble, had untreated ADHD as well. But I never knew that this moment, and you wouldn't even call it a trauma, it was just an interaction that shaped, that's what we call a critical experience. It shaped how the beliefs that I had about myself. Nobody explicitly told me that. It was like